First off, population, it nearly quadrupled. And I'm not someone that makes you memorize numbers, but just think about this. We were 1900. Population of the world was 1.6 billion. You take 1.6, you flip those numbers around, 6.1 billion by 2000. So in 100 years, we went from 1.6 to 6.1. And so later on this semester, when we look at environmental change, there's no doubt that more people on the earth is going to cause more environmental change. And so I'm not saying that humans cause every single environmental change, but it makes sense that all of a sudden now we're going to be seeing changes as we go from essentially 1.6 to 6.1. Further, we look at a particular year. 1967 was the highest one-year population growth rate that was ever in recorded history. And so it might not look alike. Like that's a lot. 2.1%, big deal. But as far as human history, that is the highest rate that was ever been recorded and will probably ever be recorded as far as we know. Further, the largest one-year population increase, and so the largest increase to a population, 1987, in which there was 93 million people added during that calendar year. So what I'm getting to here is we're starting to see a pattern in which the second half of the 20th century is really where you see a large population growth. Further, we saw the shortest time for the population to double. It took only 39 years for our population to double. And so we went from 3 to 6 billion, only took 39 years. That's not a lot of time, and once again, we'll never see a doubling time like that ever again. Further, also we see the shortest time to add 1 billion persons. So the latter half of the 20th century, in fact, the last part of the 20th century, we saw took only 12 years to add 1 billion persons. It took to add the next billion, it took 13 years. And so what you're seeing is things are starting to slow down, though. And so once again, the second half of the 20th century, especially, you'll never see a demographic century like that in the history of the world. How cool is that you lived during that? So what caused this major change? Well, first off, we can see revolutionary declines in mortality. And so revolutionary, of course, a big word. We've talked about this before, but major changes. People living longer. And so 1900, the average earthling lived to be 30 years old. By 2000, that was doubled to over doubled to 65 years old. And so essentially what's going on there is the advancements in medicine, advancements in the spread of medical information, essentially medical awareness, but combined with all kinds of industrial revolution, all kinds of inventions, the discovery era of coming up with new ideas, science, education. And so all of that leads to this increasing population, essentially because people live longer. At the same time, though, we had unprecedented declines in terms of fertility, or in terms of the number of children a woman or an average earthling will have. And I'll come back and explain this. It's kind of weird. You're like, wait a minute. How can a woman have 5.2 children? But we'll explain that a little bit later on. But on average, a woman had over 5 children in 1900. By 2000, the global average was less than 3. What's going on there? Well, a few different things, but for the most part, it's improvement in gender equality. Women having much more of a say in terms of reproduction. And so essentially women becoming not baby makers, but actually someone who's, actually gainfully employed, working in, local industry, working in the local community, and so more than just reproducers. And so we think about women's equality, we can really see this in the United States. And in the United States, most universities have more women than men. And so we really see women's equality there. Whereas you go to other parts of the world, not so much. But you see, still see some gender equality issues. You still see women not getting paid as much as men. But for the most part, throughout the world, what's happening is women are getting an education, women are starting a family, women are getting married. They're the ones that are kind of controlling things, but also deciding when reproduction occurs. This kind of goes hand in hand with the next one, and that's in terms of increases in literacy or level of education. So we think about 1850, 10% of the world population could read and write. Today, it's about 80%. So what you can see is what that means is it's going to spread information, spread awareness, spread ideas. And so the do's and don'ts, let's say, as far as medical awareness. So all this combines with, when we think about how do women become equal, well, they learn of different situations, across other places in the world, and they're like, well, they're having, they have gender equality, why can't we? And so then you start getting this set in motion, women become literate, also throughout the world, more and impoverished become literate, and so then they can then rise up the socioeconomic ladder. So this is something that's happening across the world and definitely characteristic of the 20th century. Finally, something we're definitely continuing going to see, but is a definite characteristic of the 20th century, is massive amounts of international migration. So once again, throughout the whole entire human history, we have nothing like the international migration we see today, in which we have students coming from all over the world to study in Indiana. So when we think about globalization, no doubt a more recent characteristic is migration, which is going to be something we'll cover in a later chapter. But when we think about migration, one particular type of migration that definitely goes along with Industrial Revolution and the Second Agricultural Revolution is the fact that more and more people are moving to cities. So the Industrial Revolution provided more jobs for people in the cities, but also what we saw was the Second Agricultural Revolution, the British Agricultural Revolution. What it did was it mechanized agriculture. No longer do we need people living in rural areas. And so those two working hand in hand, we continue to see this particular pattern. And so for every 2 seconds, and so I've been talking for probably nearly 30 seconds, so just think of how many people are moving to cities just in the time that I've been talking. And if we think about an entire day, about 180,000 people per day across the world decide, you know what, I'm no longer going to live in a rural area, I'm going to move to an urban area. So a key theme of the 20th century, but even more so in the 21st century, is increased urbanization. So this is something you're going to continue to see. When we think about this, it relates to, once again, those revolutions. And so 1800, we had only 3% of the population in the world was living in cities. That makes sense. We're mostly agrarian. We're mostly agriculturally based. However, by 1900, the Industrial Revolution starts to kick in certain parts of the world. We see we're up to 14%. Then essentially industrialization goes global, and then we can see how across the world you see this massive increase all the way up to 45% by 2000, and then even further, how cool is this? You were living during the one moment in time, there's only going to be one of these, more than likely, that there will be more people living in urban areas than rural areas. And so that switch from people, city dwellers being a minority to majority happened about 2007, 2008, somewhere in there. And now we see by 2050 that'll be up to 70%. And so what this means is more and more people are moving to cities. And so 1960, there was about 1 billion people in the world that lived in cities. By 2030, so not too far off from now, there will be 5 billion people living in cities. And so just essentially in one generation, the urban population, particularly in developing countries, particularly in poorer countries of the world, will double. Will be the key areas for much of these increases, much of these growths. So what's happening is you're having the emergence of what we call mega cities. What is a mega city? First off, it's rapidly growing, but it has to have this particular formula. It has to have at least 10 million people. So to be a mega city, you have to have 10 million people and be growing quite rapidly. Now let's look at the rise of the megacities. In 1975, Tokyo was the largest city in the world, had 26 million people. And we think about at that time, it was by far the largest, and there are only even 2 other cities in the world that surpassed that 10 million resident requirement for a megacity. We think about just in the near future, by 2025, the United Nations says that we'll probably have 27 cities that will have at least 26 million people. And so at that one time, Tokyo was this major city, the biggest city in the world. Now we're going to have about 27 of them we're about that size. So essentially what's going on is the megacities are just essentially magnets, attracting people. And that's going to be something we'll come back to later in the semester. So this massive rural to urban migration, where are they going? Where are they coming from? All this stuff to be determined, to be discussed. So here's a chart that shows the largest urban areas in the world. And so I ask you, based on megacities, based on the requirement, how many megacities are there in the world here in, let's say, 2014, some of the most recent data? And if you calculate, there should be 29. Because if you looked over there, the population estimate, we can see as far as the cities that are above 10 million, go down to London, and we look over to the left, it is ranked number 29. So there's 29 cities currently that are over, and currently being 2014, so of course it's going to be a little dated, 2014 that are over the megacity requirement of 10 million people.